In this video, I will be going over the names of various parts of the sewing machine, and it's important that we're all using common language for these parts so that when we're talking about threading the machine or when there's a problem, everybody's on the same page using common language to refer to these parts so we all know what we're talking about. The first one here is the bobbin winding spindle. This spins when the bobbin is on it to fill it with thread. The bobbin holds the thread for the bottom of the sewing machine. This spindle slides from right to left, and when it's all the way in the right position, it will spin to fill the bobbin, and it will also lock the needle so that it stops moving up and down. This is so that when you're filling a bobbin, the needle isn't flying up and down, risking hitting this metal plate, breaking the needle. Behind the bobbin winding spindle is this metal pin that can recess into the machine for storage. That's the spool pin. It's where the spool of thread goes when you are threading the machine or winding a bobbin. And when you're looking at the machine, you will see that on the top there are actually diagrams printed on the machine itself to help remind you the steps for threading the machine or winding a bobbin. Here we have two different parts in the same place. So when you're looking at the diagram of your machine, it's important to realize that the little hook that's here on the right, which is a thread guide, is separate from this little disc on the left, which is the bobbin winding tension disc. And so when you're threading the machine, you use the thread guide. So the thread goes under the edge of the metal, through the slot and forward, and then you proceed to thread the machine. If you were winding a bobbin, instead of going through the thread guide, the thread would just come to the outside on the left of the bobbin winding spindle, of the bobbin winding tension disc, and then the thread would pass here. There would be a bobbin on the spindle. We would wrap the loose end of the thread around the bobbin. But the important thing is, you notice here, we did not wrap the thread around the tension disc. We just gently looped it around. If we wrapped it, then when we started running the machine, it would put a lot of tension on the thread wouldn't move, and it would eventually snap. If we were threading the machine and we've gone through this thread guide, from there the thread comes forward and goes down through this groove to the right. It's also labeled. There's a little number 2 here raised in the plastic so that you can have that as a reminder where your thread goes next. Inside here, there are 2 flat metal discs, and these press together, holding the thread in place. Those are called thread tension discs, and depending on where the tension dial, which is right here, depending on what this is set to, the discs hold the thread more tightly or more loosely, which impacts how fast the thread is going through the machine. Generally, once we've set this to the correct setting, this dial should never really be touched or adjusted. If once we start using the machines, you find that the thread is coming out loopy on your fabric, lots of loose threads or loose loops, it may be an issue with the tension. But generally speaking, if you think the tension needs to be adjusted, that's something that you would want my help with rather than adjusting it on your own, because there could be some other problem causing the thread to come out loose, especially if the machine's been threaded wrong or the bobbin was wound incorrectly. Over here, we have stitch width adjuster. If you were using a stitch design that has a zigzag to it, like many of these, this dial changes how far your needle goes from left to right while it's making the stitches. If this was set to 0, it would mean that the needle didn't move from left to right at all, but what that also does is moves the needle position all the way to the right. So if you watch the needle while I turn this dial, you'll see that as I turn it, the needle is moving. So if you wanted the needle as far to the left as it could go, you would turn this dial to 5. If you wanted the needle as far to the right as it could go, you would turn this dial to 0. 5 would also make the widest possible stitch when you choose one of these designs. Most of the time, we will be using a straight stitch, and we will keep our setting right in the middle. There's a little thick groove in the plastic here to help you find the middle setting, and that keeps the needle in the middle position here. So we'll pull the thread down. It will automatically align between the tension discs. Our older machines have a manual tension, so we have to thread them a little differently. That's one of the reasons why this model is going to be a little easier for everyone to learn to thread. So the next part is to put the thread through something called the take-up. The take-up is a little metal arm that moves up and down as you sew, pulling the thread with it. Unfortunately, you're looking here, we don't see any little metal arm poking out. The take-up is not visible right now. So in order to put the thread through the take-up, we need to get the take-up to be visible. So to do that, we're going to turn the hand wheel, which is this plastic wheel on the other side of the machine. We only ever turn the hand wheel toward us. It's the way that it would turn when the machine is normally operating. Instinct makes you want to turn the wheel away from you, but we don't want to strip the gears or turn the machine in a direction it's not meant to go. So we're going to turn the hand wheel toward us, and if you watch, you'll see the take-up arm come just slightly up and down like this. So we will leave it in its highest position here so that when we bring the thread up and we loop it over this arm from the right to the left and we pull forward, now the thread is trapped in the take-up because there is a hole inside and a groove, so the thread slips in and is held right here. And it's important, like I said, that you go from right to left when you pass over the top of the take-up. And now the thread comes straight down, and above the needle here, when you look really closely, there is a little hook here just above the needle. This is one step that we often overlook when we're threading the machine. A lot of students will overlook this. This is another thread guide here, and it is important to make sure you do loop the thread behind the thread guide. Again, you're moving from right to left. then we pull the thread. And next we would thread the needle. There's an eye in the point of the needle, and the thread is going to go straight through the eye from front to back. And that might not work quite so well right now because I am using a very thick thread that normally we would use for sewing on buttons, but I wanted to use something that was going to show up well in the video. Fitting it through the eye of the needle is another story, so I'm going to leave that for now. Here, this gray piece of plastic here behind the needle, when you move this up and down, it raises and lowers this piece of metal. This is called the presser foot. Its job is to hold the fabric against the face of the machine. And so this is the presser foot lifter. It raises and lowers that foot. I'm going to remove the foot, which is easy on these machines. There's a little button in the back of the shank here, and you just push it and the foot drops straight off. But I'm removing the foot so you can see underneath here what this looks like. This piece of metal is called the throat plate, and on the throat plate you can see there are some grid lines engraved into it, scratched into it. They are marked. Those will help you to keep your seam allowance consistent. Seam allowance is the distance from the edge of the fabric to where your stitching lines will be. And it becomes really important once we start working on projects, and we'll talk about that more later. So in the throat plate, you'll see there's some holes here. One hole goes all the way through to the bottom, and this is where the needle goes in and out when you're sewing. The way that the machine works, it has a top thread, which is the one coming off the spool that we just threaded through, that would then be going through the eye of the needle. The other thread, the bottom thread, comes from a bobbin, which is in here. We'll talk about this more in a moment. But as the needle goes up and down, and it's bringing the thread into the bottom of the machine, that thread is interlocking with the one coming out of the bottom of the machine on the bobbin, and it makes a chain of stitches, and that's what holds your fabric together. So here on the throat plate, underneath where the presser foot is going to sit, there are these little metal teeth. These are called the feed dogs, and as the machine is running, these lift up and move back, and I can show you by turning the hand wheel again toward me, and you can see as the needle goes down, so do the feed dogs, and as the needle goes up, the feed dogs move back up, and then they move slightly forward and down, and it's sort of like the motion of a conveyor belt or an escalator or anything like that that's going to work automated to move something. And so that's how the feed dogs push the fabric through the machine. You don't have to push the fabric. The machine will pull it through itself. So I'm going to put the foot back on, which we just can lower the shank into place, and it will click right on. And now the foot is back in place. And here we have the bobbin compartment. There is a little door here, which we release by moving this little button. It has a spring in it. We move that to the right, it pops the door loose, and we can remove it. Inside here, we have the bobbin. This one already has thread on it, so it's already been filled. There is a diagram here to remind you the correct way to place the bobbin, but you always want the thread to be coming off of the left side of the bobbin. Then you drop the bobbin down here into the bobbin case. On some machines, bobbins are front loading, so there'll be a little door here in the front that flips down, and the bobbin case actually is removable. You put the bobbin in the case, you put the case back in the machine. All machines thread slightly differently. All machines have their own little quirks and steps, and so if you have a different machine at home, or if we're using a different model from this at school, you'll get used to how that machine threads and where all of its little parts are that might be set up differently than this one. If you're not sure, almost every type of machine has a manual online somewhere so that you can look up the threading instructions. This model, the Brother XL 2600i, this is a student machine. It's pretty basic, but it works really well for what we do with it. So after you've dropped the bobbin in here, you need to take the loose tail of the thread, and there is a groove here in the front that you pass the thread to the front of the bobbin and through that groove, and it just tails off to the side. There's actually a tiny razor in here that will cut the thread automatically. And so we can put the door back on. We slide it so that the tab is under the edge, and then we angle it down and snap it into place. And now we have our bobbin in the case. One other part of the machine that's pretty important is here. This is the reverse button on this machine. That's another aspect that's different on a lot of other types of machines. For this particular machine, we push this button all the way down and hold it in place when we want to reverse or sew backward. Up here you see the different designs of stitches. We did talk about those before. This is where we would adjust which stitch we're using. So this green knob here, this is the stitch selector dial, and it has these numbers which correlate with the numbers of the designs. Most of the time we're going to be using number 2, the plain straight stitch. So we need to turn this wheel so that number 2 is at the top here. But we also need to turn the gray wheel, because you see the second row of designs has this SS label, and you see here the SS is pointing to the top where the arrow is. What that means is the secondary stitch choices here are the ones that you're going to be choosing if the SS is selected. And so if we left the machine like this, we wouldn't be using a straight stitch number 2. We'd actually be doing these parallel lines number 14, because that's the secondary stitch. So we need to change this setting. This gray wheel behind the stitch selector is the stitch length knob. The stitch length determines how far does the fabric move in between each up and down of the needle. So in other words, how long are your stitches? How far is the distance between each point where the needle goes in and out of the fabric? And most of the time, if your stitch length is at 3, that's going to be the best setting for stitches that are short enough to hold permanently, but long enough so that if you make a mistake, they're not going to be super difficult to remove. So usually when we're doing a straight stitch, we have our stitch selector on 2, our stitch length on 3, and remember before, we keep our stitch width in the middle, 2.5, which allows us to keep the needle in the center position, which is going to make it easier for us to line up where we're sewing, and it's also going to make those seam allowance guides on the throat plate work for us with correct measurements, because those are based on the needle being in center position. One other thing that I will point out in terms of parts of the machine is just to say that I don't want you to start to be confused between the term presser foot and what this is. This is the foot pedal. This goes on the floor, and then you press it with your foot just like you were driving a car, like the gas pedal of a car. So just like the gas pedal of a car, you're going to want to ease the pressure onto the pedal until you're comfortable with controlling the speed of the machine, because that's how you make the machine go faster or slower, is by how hard you push this pedal. And early on, it's going to be a lot easier for you to control the machine if you can control your speed. But again, don't confuse foot pedal with presser foot. This foot is the one that holds the fabric in place. This pedal is the one that runs the machine. So that's basically all of the instructions for the basics of the names of the parts of the machine, their functions, and a little bit of information on how to thread the machine. So if we keep this video handy, keep track of where it is here in our classroom page. If we were to end up in a situation where we are full remote before we've had time to practice using the machines in class, or if you are already a full remote student and you won't have the benefit of hands-on practice in class, then hopefully this video will be adequate to help guide you through the steps so that you can use the machine on your own.